Hello, welcome. We're going to get started. So the title of this session, Why Can't We Be Friends? The Tension and Opportunities Between Faculty and Ed Tech, suggests that we aren't friends. And so the goal I have today for this session is that next year we'll all be back talking about how we're thriving as friends as opposed to being on two opposite sides of the table. So we're going to dive right in, and I'm going to turn to the esteemed set of panelists here, and we're going to try not to talk about Taylor Swift, which is what we just talked about before getting on the stage, and try to focus on the subject at hand. But we're going to start off with just saying that the title suggests that we're not friends, and so I'd love to hear from the panelists why you think that's true. And so I will start with Michael.
Okay. So it absolutely is a true statement. It's a real problem, it's a significant problem, and it's one that's very difficult to quantify. So for example, both of the companies on this stage, 2U and Course Hero, have had some pretty significant negative press in the academic press, as have their product categories. Right? I don't have to tell you what that press said. You can go and read it. You can get a sense of what's being said about them. At the same time, both of these companies can honestly say that they have significant numbers of educators that they work with who are very happy with them and happy to sing their praises. So it's not a simple answer. But I think in general, the brand value of the average large ed tech company is somewhere between that of your cable company and a health insurance company. And I think there are three reasons for it very quickly. One is that product market fit at scale is really, really hard in ed tech. It's not like telecom. It's really, teaching is a very complex and difficult endeavor. We talk about personalized learning. That really means that we're dealing with persons in a very deep way. And so to build a company at scale, you really have to kind of rise above that. And so the second related reason is that a lot of these ed tech companies that reach scale are not, in fact, teaching and learning companies at their core. Again, an OPM product category has been historically about helping universities execute on delivering degree programs at scale. It's not that the companies don't care about the teaching and learning, but that's not really what they're paid to do at their core. And likewise, companies in the homework sector, like Course Hero, they're essentially consumer companies. They deal directly with students. Now, again, we have gentlemen here who both have titles that suggest that these companies really do care about teaching and learning, and I believe that's true. I know the CEOs of both companies, and I think they are genuinely committed to it. But it's not where these industries have historically made their money. And then the third problem is that there's a huge cultural gap, and educators just don't understand the kinds of pressures that companies are under in order to deliver, and the same thing is true in the other direction. Understanding each other, they live in just vastly different worlds operating on vastly different time scales.
That was excellent. Thank you, Michael. Luyen, how do you think about the sense of this is true, of why we can't get along?
Well, I guess for me, the question is literally a bit of a conundrum, because I'm not sure which of the two I actually am. I'm an educator who went into ed tech and who's responsible for the educational outcomes of an educational technology company. I think actually a lot of things that Michael raises are true. I actually think the cultural issue is the deepest challenge.
Yeah.
That institutional education really, not only has it not thought of itself as a business, right? So the term, like even saying something like product market fit. You walk into a group of faculty members and you say something like product market fit and you'll get laughed out of the room. And there are good reasons for that. I understand the historical sort of impetus behind that. Similarly, I think that most companies, and for those of you out here, I see a lot of familiar faces who have been at this meeting for many, many, many years. Many of you know that those of us in the private sector side of it don't think about, haven't traditionally thought about outcomes, learning outcomes, as much as we've thought about business outcomes. And so if you take a business like the OPM sector, actually that was part of the beauty of the marriage, was we let the educational institutions worry about the learner outcomes and the educational outcomes. And we let those educational institutions not have to worry about the business outcomes, but to benefit from those that are being driven by the industrial partner. I think those days are over. Like, I don't think you can compete in this business as an ed tech unless you are relentlessly focused on outcomes, learner outcomes, as much as business outcomes. And I don't think as an educational institution you can be successful going forward if you're not also focused on the business outcomes of your institution. So I actually think the question is more around, how do we accelerate that realization that we have to be not just friends, but deeply partnered, both in terms of educational outcomes and in terms of business outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to give Jesse and Sean a chance to opine on the first question, and then I'd love to circle back, Jesse, especially from your perspective, because you're the last standing educator in the purest form on the panel, even though everybody here has been an educator in some sense. So I'd love to hear either if you want to talk directly to anything Mike or Luyen said, or...
Well, a couple things. If I think about what it is to be a teacher or an educator in this conversation, oftentimes at institutions of education, and I have been in administrative roles, I also collaborate regularly with ed tech. I'm also consider myself a critic of ed tech, but I can talk a little bit more about what that means. If I think about what it is to be an educator in this conversation, increasingly I would say that the work of teaching is deeply precarious. And if we can look at particular data points, like 70% of teachers in higher education being adjunct or contingent laborers, or we can look at the fact that in higher education, 1 in 2, less than half of teachers get preparation, significant preparation for the work of teaching. So oftentimes they're not being supported. Teachers don't feel like we're being supported at the level of our labor, but also that our work isn't being supported or being valorized. And when I think about what it also means to just be a precarious teacher, increasingly so many news stories, I feel like teachers and the work of teaching gets demonized. And if I think about the kinds of conversations that I've been at institutions as an administrator, oftentimes the adoption of an educational technology, there are no or very few teachers in the room in those conversations. And oftentimes those technologies are adopted across the institution, and then their use is obligated. So the teachers find themselves having to use tools that they didn't have a significant conversation about the adoption of. And I think that that's where some of the tension comes from. So increasingly, like if I had to say, I know which one I am. I feel like I'm a teacher at my core, but I also feel like being brought into those conversations is so utterly, utterly essential.
Yeah, that's a great point. It sounds like a communication issue from what you and Luyen said. And Sean, do you want to weigh in, and then we'll...
Sure. So actually, can I just ask how many educators are in the room? Wow, that's fantastic. That's awesome. Because I think that, and I would actually love to sort of know how that happened, because that wasn't what I expected at all. And that's great. I think that for me, and this actually echoes a lot of what's being said here, and we're supposed to be contentious, but I think that's, for me, there's the two, edtech and education, are having conversations that just sort of pass each other in the night. They're not really in the same room. They're not really talking about the same things. And so the sorts of things that Jesse brings up in terms of the precarity of faculty and the kind of lack of training that they have, lack of support that they have, and then the expectation that they're going to utilize educational technology that's suddenly foisted upon them, doesn't really enter into the conversation on the edtech side. So edtech's not really even talking about, well, what is the condition of teaching? What is the situation that people are teaching under? And so I think there's a real lack of conversation there. One of the things that I think is really important to consider too is that when EdTech tends to have conversations with educators, and this is, again, I would love to have a rousing conversation with everybody in here, but one of the things that I think tends to happen is that educational technology will look at sort of the mainstream teachers who are going to reinforce their ideas about the way that education works. Jesse and I both sort of sit on the edge of education, at least from a pedagogical standpoint, and we've often been critics of education, education, yes, and ed tech, because of that sort of outlook. And educational technology tends to work toward a sort of a mainstream and not toward edge cases, and not toward thinking about what was the unusual experiences students are having. What are the things we can't predict? What are the things that an algorithm can't deal with? And similarly, when EdTech is talking to educators, tend to talk to the educators who are concerned with learning outcomes, who are concerned with grades, who are concerned with the sort of standards of student success. But there is a whole bevy of educators out there who aren't considering those things and are much more concerned with the humanizing side of education. That and doesn't enter into the conversation with EdTech, generally speaking. And so I think that there's a reason to sort of begin to embrace those edge cases, both in terms of the students who are using product, but also the educators that we consult with from an EdTech perspective, so that we can begin to have really rich, meaningful conversations that might surprise all of us.
So it seems like the common thread from all four of the answers was a lack of full understanding of the person on the other side of the technology. And so the question and from me would be, how do we hear those voices, recognizing that it's not a one-size-fits-all, so that the business side can make sure, like Luyen said, is hyper-focused on outcomes, similar, so they have the same priorities or aligned. And I wonder how, if any of us have seen from our own experience with your companies, whether it be Argos or Course Hero or 2U, where that's been done quite well. And then from the faculty perspective, if you've seen it done well, and if yes, where, and what does that look like? And then I'd also like to hear kind of where your perspectives are coming from. So what was your background that made you answer the first question the way you did? You can pick which one you want to answer first. Jesse, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so if I think about, I mentioned earlier that I consider myself a critic of EdTech. For me, that is not at odds with my being friends with educational technologists or my being friends with educational technology companies. It means that I want to have hard conversations with them because that's how I do the work of being a critic. It means that I have to be willing to sit in the room and have the conversation. And so I think if I go back 22 years ago when I first started teaching, the first things I was reading as an educator were bell hooks, Paulo Freire, studying critical pedagogy, pushing back on grades. And what I noticed over the course, and then for 17 years, I've been doing faculty development, so teaching teachers. And one of the things that I would say is that over the 22 years that I've been teaching, I've watched educational technologies have an increasing influence on the work that I was doing at my institutions, an increasing influence on the relationships I was having with my colleagues, and an increasing influence on the relationships that I was able to build with students. And so if anything, my interest in educational technology, well, partly stems from my dad made me do a lot of coding because I was a humanities major, and he wanted me to study something real. And so he would give me side jobs in data analysis and coding. And so I learned how to use technology. And so, but really when I started studying educational technology and putting that to use was when I saw what an influence it was having. And I saw also how it was getting in the way of so many of the relationships and frustrating the relationships. And ultimately, if I think about something, for example, like how I met my students 22 years ago, I would walk into class, I would have a single-page syllabus. As each of them walked in, I would hand them the piece of the paper. They would take the piece of paper, sit down. There was this very sort of analog interaction. And it was also meaningful to me that they knew nothing about the class when they stepped in, that what we built together from the first day. increasingly, as I've seen learning management systems adopted at institutions and then being required by institutions and us being required to use them in very particular ways, my students meet the learning management system before they meet me. So if I think about why this conversation is so important to me, is because building those human relationships between me and students requires that I not only think about how do I meet them in that room, whether that room is digital or virtual. How do I start with hello, how are you, and not start with the bureaucracy that we so often find in a learning management system. But it also means that I have to look at the landscape of education and kick down whatever barriers that I see that are in the way. And that doesn't necessarily mean kicking companies or kicking people. It means saying, this thing is in our way. Let's push it to the side. We need to sit down together and talk. Doesn't mean that that thing gets cast off. It means we need to sit down and have a conversation. And then, hey, let's look over at Canvas and say, what can we use that for? Is there anything we can use it for? That for me is like what brings me to this conversation and why I feel so passionate about it, because I don't think we can just bat our eyes and have these technologies go away, or bat our eyes and suddenly have teaching feel like it felt 22 years ago. It changes and it's iterative, it's constantly changing. So it's not like 22 years before 22 years ago it was the same. I look at technologies like the grade book. The grade book itself is a technology, and it's a technology that's been around for a relatively short period of time, a couple hundred years, and has also influenced. But I think that raising our eyebrows at and having critical conversations is the way that we put that to use and the way that we find each other in those rooms.
Yeah. So I see a lot of head nodding. Luyen, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think it's totally fair. I love the point. I mean, so maybe I'll flip the order of the questions. I started my career as a teacher in a Manhattan classroom, a high school classroom in 1989. And with a bunch of crazy teachers and technology, I happen to be the only person literally in the school who could program a computer, just because it was a hobby of mine. We built a simulated archaeological excavation in 4 black and white Macintosh computers that replaced a textbook-bound curriculum on ancient civilization. I didn't even know what constructivism was until I actually saw this thing in action. And I said to myself, like, this is a revolution in learning. It wasn't a revolution in technology, it was a revolution in learning. And I think that's why the tension and opportunity are so importantly paired in the title of this event, because EdTech is not a digital phenomenon. The number 2 pencil is educational technology. The blackboard is an educational technology. The blue book is an educational technology. No one would have this conversation about Crayola's lack of leaning into educational improvement, right? We just wouldn't have that panel discussion. So that speaks to the fact that there's something about digital technology that, just like all other sectors of human industry, human activity, is particularly fecund with opportunity to help us to really reinvent the way we do something. So to me, the tension is around perhaps an impatience, a frustration with not being able to realize that opportunity in the time frame that we would like to. It's taken me 33 years to get to this point. I thought no one would teach or learn the same way within 3 years of our having built that simulation, right? And you walk into a K-12 classroom in New York City, it looks a whole heck of a lot like the classroom I taught in '89 before we built this archaeology simulation. And so I think some of this is about a realization that we have a moment in the history of education to really rewrite the entire playbook. And that is both incredibly invigorating and exciting, but also massively disruptive and threatening. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right. I mean, I think we have to, as a community, it's not about the technology. It's about us getting together and saying, how do we, and not even about like, well, here's this thing called Canvas. How do we use it in a way that's useful? It's how do we flip that conversation and say, what would we like to do as educators, and how does a technology serve that vision of an outcome that is better than what we've done in the past?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Michael, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. So, look, I came from a family of teachers, both my sisters, both my parents. was no real question about me doing anything except education. And not only was I one of those people who would laugh at the phrase product market fit, but I would not be sitting up on this stage if I hadn't started a blog 16 years ago bashing edtech companies for not getting teaching and learning right. And what happened over time, as I started to examine why they weren't getting it, quote unquote, right, is that I started to understand some of their complexities that they were dealing with in their world, and I started to meet some of them, and they were good people, and they were smart people, and they were really trying hard, and I started to see how their dysfunction as an institution fit like a puzzle piece with the dysfunction of the institution, the universities, right? That in fact, these companies exist because they're meeting a demand that's being expressed to them, right? And so, and on this journey, as this was happening, I worked for some ed tech companies, I consulted, I was sort of a marriage counselor consultant between ed tech companies and universities. I learned phrases like product market fit and brand value. I started this thing called the Empirical Educator Project, which could have been called Why Can't We Be Friends? It was really about trying to get both sides working together on some common projects. And out of that grew this thing that I never thought I'd end up doing, which is a startup, working with universities, 2 universities collaborating on open source, funded by a university. And the deeper in I've gotten at each stage, the more I realized how ignorant I was in the previous stage about the people I was working with. Until now, in a startup, I recently said to one of my higher ed collaborators, who has been a friend of mine for years, you operate in geologic time and I operate on fruit fly time. It's a wonder we can even recognize each other as sentient beings. So there is just look, we're learning a lot in terms of DEI about lived experience and how we can't just take for granted that empathy and conversation will be enough. Lived experience really matters. And so it's great to see these companies hiring educators like the gentleman to my right to be part of their company. It shows that we're making progress on understanding that. And it really we need a lot of deep work together to get to where we need to go.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue too, Sean, because now you've had deep insight into the education side, and now you're on the ed tech side. I don't know how deep it is since it's when did you start at Coursera?
January.
Oh, that's plenty of time. So you've been there 4 months. So now you have
Eons in ed tech.
eons. So you have all of the details to be able to shed light on how we can both work together as opposed to
It's
being
interesting.
opponents.
I mean, it is something that we're still trying to figure out. When I was first when I first found out I was going to be on this panel, I just assumed I was coming on as an educator and not as not representing ed tech. I was like,
No, that's too easy.
oh right, I'm ed tech now. And so it's actually really fascinating. And I think there's actually something really interesting going on in this conversation, because I think what we're finding is that there is a lot more alignment than we recognize that there is. I think there are fundamental differences. And this is something that I'm working with inside of Course Hero. So when I first came to Course Hero, I was asked to apply to the position because of my history with pedagogy, and because I was sort of on the edge of that. They wanted someone in the company who would push the pedagogy side of things. And one of the first things that I said when I was in the interview process was I talked about, can we talk about a difference between educational technology and pedagogical technology? And is there a way to think about technology as an actual not system, but a place where learning happens, where it can be responsive to the way that learners behave. And one of the things that I liked about the nature of this particular platform was that it's very much student directed in a lot of ways. So they come to it and they use it the way that they feel they need to. And as a teacher, that was always part of what I did too. It was, and if I'm going to use a metaphor that Jesse always used, and that is that it's sort of like being a party planner, where you bring the games and you bring all the stuff, and then you let people come in the room and they do what they want to with it. And to me, that's a really wonderful way to teach, because you're providing all of the material that needs to be covered, or that you need to investigate, but you're letting students guide the process. And this is a very critical pedagogical kind of perspective on things. Similarly, I think that if we look at educational technology from that angle, and if we look at ways to make the technology itself student-directed, then all of a sudden we're going to find that it's much more pedagogical in its delivery, I guess, in its use. So I think what I'm finding fascinating about this conversation is that there just feels like we all have education backgrounds. We all have ed tech backgrounds. We all have and it's a really interesting thing that we were brought up onto this stage to be put our boxing gloves on, and it's not exactly what's happening at all. I think that one of the things that I talked about earlier, I think, with a colleague, was that we have education and technology cares about education. Teachers care about education. They're coming at it from two different angles, but they want the same thing. They want students to win, basically. Well, most educators want students to win. They want it to be a place where knowledge is created, where knowledge is produced, where innovation happens, where all these really wonderful things can occur inside that classroom and outside the classroom. And I think that's also an important piece of what we need to think about when we're talking about education technology, is we need to be thinking about what happens when it's turned off. What happens when you're away from the screen? Is what's happening on the screen in some way providing for what happens off the screen? Because most learning doesn't happen in the classroom. Most learning doesn't happen on the screen, right? It happens when you're away from that. It happens when you're processing it, when you're thinking about things, when you're sleeping, when you're showering. And so how does the ed tech support that kind of learning? Or is it just about the platform? As long as you're engaged with the platform, something's happening. But can we inspire it happening outside that platform, away from the technology? So I don't know if that even, I ran way off a different direction. But
No, that was great. And I think what I was hearing, which I would love for everybody to respond to, is that both sides have to give up a level of control. And so from an educator perspective, how do you let the students construct, like you did, an ancient civilization lesson? Or how do you, as the teacher, Jesse, in the door, be okay with the fact that they're maybe going to meet other parts of the curriculum before they meet you? I don't know how that works and same, like, how does to you let a little of the control go as they're merging together?
No, I think it's a great question, and one of the things I was thinking about is also not all ed tech companies and not all educational institutions are built the same way, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there are ed tech companies that have much greater and deeper mission alignment with educational institutions, and others that are more threatening or disruptive, whatever you want to call it. And one of the things I really love about the higher education online program management business as a business or as a sector is that we're really, really tightly aligned with university partners on the goals that we're trying to deliver. Like we only succeed if we drive towards these common goals. And sure, it may require challenging both how an educational partner institution thinks about, what goes into producing a degree, what they do well versus what a partner does well. It may force us to rethink, how much we need to rely on the educational partner, what we need to be able to do internally. But at the end of the day, there's tremendous alignment around the delivery of the outcome for the student. And so, to me, that's where you have the most velocity towards friendship, is when you are very clear that you can only really succeed if you're driving towards the same goal. That is not true of all parts of ed tech. Right? There are parts of ed tech that are quite a bit more fundamentally threatening to what institutional educators and educational institutions are providing. And there may be benefit to that in certain cases too, but I think we should be clear, it's not one answer for all ed tech companies either.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I think there's actually a missing conversant here, which is the venture capital community. And we should point out, Emily, you also were a teacher. So
as a
you bring
teacher.
a special perspective here. But there is, I think, sort of, there's a complexity, going back to the point about scaling product market fit in education. It's a big, hairy, scary problem. And if you're an investor making high risk bets, you're not going to like that hairy, scary problem, right? So I remember, I've been coming to this conference for years and years, and before it was disrupt education, right? Well, because it's easier to build a challenger and think about that than it is to deal with the complexity of these, 1,000-year-old institutions that haven't really, been planned or even grown. They've just sort of accreted over time, right? And then sort of things went quiet for a while, and now we're starting to hear about Web3, which is disrupt education, 2. There's a move to workforce learning, which is easier, and so on and so forth. And so I think it takes some courage on the part of the venture capital community to say, if we really, value this, we need to be giving, right? Because all edtech, all edtech VCs talk about the values and the mission. I'll be, totally blunt and say, my experience so far is that a small subset of them walk the walk. And by that I mean, take mission-related risks that put their bottom line, more at risk. It's a tough thing to do, and we need to be able to do it if we're really going to move the needle.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I guess I would also say there's a missing conversant here. So often when I see education and educators and ed tech being what I would describe as pitted against one another, and we see this a lot in the educational press, we see this on social media, there are much less friendly conversations out there than the one that we're having on this stage. And so often when those conversations get relatively explosive, there is a group of people who are taking a lot of collateral damage, and that's students. And I would say they're the people who are missing in this conversation. They're the missing conversants. Something I've said before is that we need to stop having conversations about the future of education without students in the room. And that doesn't just mean students in the room. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. It means also students on the stage. When are students going to be drivers of these conversations? Ultimately, when I look at the title of this and I think about the tensions and opportunities in faculty relations with ed tech, I think, I started by talking about how missing faculty often are in decision-making around technology adoption at institutions. Students are not only not missing from that conversation, in some cases, they try and voice their concerns, and their concerns are ignored. And I've watched this happen. And their concerns are ignored not just in a dismissive way, but often in an incredibly patronizing way. So I guess I would say that the thing that my ire is less towards this particular debate, and it's more towards the structures that have created a system where students aren't directly involved in the building of their own educations. At the syllabus level, at the curricular level, at the institutional level, why aren't students shaping our educational institutions?
Yeah, it's a great question, which goes a little bit to Sean's point with the control. My children are in a progressive education school, and it is amazing to me watching how they grow up, being taught to construct their own syllabus, to create what they want to learn, as opposed to how I grew up, which was what we're doing to you all now, just talking at you in a one-to-many structure, which is not, I'm sure you'll forget 70% of this from the forgetting curve. Not that you all weren't incredible talkers. So I guess that's, we have 5 minutes left. We talked a little bit about the solutions going forward. So one would be to bring in the students. The other would be to really listen to both sides. But I'd love to hear kind of real practical examples of that, like what you're doing at Course Hero on that front, what you're doing at 2U, what you're doing at Argos, what you've experienced, Jesse, in the most positive way from dealing with ed tech solutions with teaching faculty or with teaching students, whatever it may be. I think that'd be a great way to wrap this all up. So we'll start with you, Sean.
Sure. Really on the practical side, I want to say first of all just that working for and on a platform that is primarily user-generated content, that is basically developed by the what students contribute, kind of is an example of that. And one of the things that, it's actually I think one of the reasons why a lot of educators have a problem with Course Hero is that students are in control. And I think that's difficult for a lot of educators. They're not accustomed to that. And often students are using Course Hero outside of the boundaries of the classroom, so it's not sort of a thing that has been condoned or administered in any way. So it's not like the LMS, it's not like another educational technology that exists free on the web. And so, meaning free, wild, it's just there on the web. And I think I think any time that a student is using the internet in that way, I mean, we've seen this from ages ago, right? When the internet first dawned, everyone got worried the students were going to cheat online. They were going to use, it was going to be easier to plagiarize, blah, blah, blah. And that has never stopped. It's just now you can like pinpoint it to certain companies. And I think but what's at the core of that is a lack of trust of students and the need to really let students take some control of their education. And so one of the things that, from my side, from my position at Course Hero, one of the things that I want to be able to do is work with educators to understand how the internet works, to really talk through digital literacy, to talk through how can you incorporate this into your class. So instead of saying keep your laptop closed or don't use that website or whatever you, okay, no, instead let's invite that conversation into the classroom. How can we use this constructively, and to really sort of bring students into the education process that way.
So it's a lot of change behavior, change management.
To me, the opportunity I'm most excited about in terms of the collaboration between faculty, educators, and EdTech is around learning science, learning research, and learning data. So just to give you a little bit of perspective again, when I started teaching in 1989, it wasn't until a year later that you could get an academic degree in learning science, thanks to Roger Schenck at Northwestern.
Yeah.
It literally wasn't a discipline, right? Now, as a result of that, the flip side of it is we have 30 plus years of really rigorous academic research into what works in student learning. I would argue the next level, the next stage of the evolution, though, is to data-driven learning science and learning research. So I was, my colleague, Anant Agarwal, who many of you know, the founder of edX, was here earlier, I think. I don't know if he's still here, but he was saying to me the other day, and I know Nina's here too, and she was responsible for a lot of this. But since 2020, there have been 120 published academic research studies that have used the anonymized aggregated data from click data from edX as the basis of their research. 50% of all academic studies in MOOCs in the last 2 years, have used edX data sets. Research that used to take us years to actually do in a research-based double-blind control study, we can do instantaneously now through data analytics. Certainly at 2U, but I would challenge the rest of the industry to do this as well. We are committed to really open sourcing that data in an anonymized, secure, non-identifiable way to really sort of help drive a step change in academic research around learning. And I think those are the types of collaborations that will have really concrete impact on everything that we're trying to achieve in a way that we can't do on our own and faculty can't do on their own.
Yeah.
So I called my project the Empirical Educator Project for a reason. I very much believe in what Luyen just said. And one of the challenges is that educators don't see themselves in that story, a lot of them, especially humanities educators. So for us at Argos, what we're thinking about a lot is educators as knowledge workers. The best longitudinal study we have, the Gallup-Purdue study, shows what we have always known is true, really is true, which is that a good teacher changes lives. A good teacher can improve your lifelong well-being in every way, mental well-being, financial well-being, physical health, and so on, right? So what we want to do is help create more life-changing teachers. And when we start to examine their workflows and how EdTech currently, gets in the way or helps those workflows, and we start finding activities that they don't even have language for, because it's a lot of what they do is intuitive. It's sort of art more than craft, in the sense that it's not articulated to them. That's where we can begin to talk to them, because they're analyzing every day how their students are doing. But the word learning, the phrase learning analytics is completely foreign to them. So we have to find ways to bridge that gap. And we're discovering every day in our research just how much tacit knowledge there is that we can tap into.
I'll say something briefly since we're mostly out of time. So I'm here in two roles. One, I've been a teacher of 22 years. I'm also the Higher Education Pedagogy Fellow for the Hope Center for College Community and Justice, which is an organization that is focused on food and housing insecurity, but also basic needs insecurity and mental health. And I guess I would ask us and challenge us, if we know, which the data is showing, that 1 in 2 of our students have been food insecure in the last 30 days, how do we use that knowledge to fundamentally change the way that we design our syllabi, but also the way that we design our educational technologies? When we're asking questions of students, when we're collecting data from students, if we don't start from the place of acknowledging that our students are experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, acute and chronic trauma, especially in the wake of the pandemic, we aren't building good technologies and we aren't building good courses.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panelists. And I think the takeaway is keep students at the center.